All right, welcome to Work World Writing, where we learn to write in ways that sometimes make our high school English teachers a little bit nervous. Today we are going to talk about the difference between rules and meaning. And so I have scanned in my writer's guide. I have several of these on my shelf in my office. It's just a big book full of writing rules. And I noticed right off the bat, I'm already on a second edition. And like, what's wrong with the first edition? Was there errors to these rules, And it's kind of true that when we think of these rules, it's not like a math thing. Like, this is language. It's evolving and changing. And so we should treat these things that we call rules maybe a little differently. So here's an example, the comma. It's very common. I like what it says right at the beginning. The comma was invented to help readers. And I think that's good to keep in mind, that everything I do on paper, I'm trying to help my reader make sense of what I'm saying. More than me just memorizing a rule. But yeah, I'm trying to make sure I'm coming across with a clear meaning. If I look here at the very first rule here in the comma, about commas, one that's very, very common, it says use a comma before a coordinating conjunction joining independent clauses. And that's all well and good rule, but I notice right away we've got an exception to the rule. And that's very common in this book, where I have a rule and then I have an exception right away. I need to keep that in mind about these rules. Here's one that we learned when we were pretty young, use a comma between all items in a series. But even in this book, just a little bit down here, we've got a discussion about some people omitting that comma before the last item and some people putting it in. And this book says, oh no, you should put it in. But I know published writers that certainly would omit that comma and argue for its omission. There's another example here. I've got a rule and an exception at the bottom. It happens more often than we realize. Here's one here. Use a comma to prevent confusion. I love that one. I can't believe that's a rule. Use a comma to prevent confusion. I just imagine a teacher coming up to a student saying, you shouldn't have a comma here. And the student looks at the teacher and says, well, I'm just trying to prevent confusion, I don't know. We just got to keep these rules in perspective. And I think that we should avoid treating them like some kind of a math problem, that if I memorize the steps, I'm going to get to the right answer. Instead, I really want to focus on the meaning behind it. Donald Murray, Pulitzer Prize-winning writer, says this: the writer should not follow rules, but follow language towards meaning, always seeking to understand what is appearing on the page, to see it clearly, to evaluate it clearly, for clear thinking will produce clear writing. And I would move towards this more than I would memorizing rules. When I think about rules, I always write this on the board in class. I think it's kind of appropriate. So I write down ELA and we try and figure out what each letter means, and eventually we get to it: English Language Arts. And so it's an art form. It's not about memorizing rules as much as it is looking at the meaning behind behind the language, and focusing on keeping that as clear as possible. Thanks for listening. More to come.